Welcome to the SheSpeaks podcast, a podcast created to elevate women's voices across diverse backgrounds on topics impacting women. I'm your host, Aliza Freud, founder and CEO of SheSpeaks. Each week, I have a conversation with a woman expert who shares her best how-to advice on a topic so we can learn how to better do that one thing from a woman who's been there and done that. Our hope is that these conversations help you feel more inspired to speak up and be heard in your own life and work. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back to the show. Hope you're all having a great week so far. So I am really excited to share with you today's episode. Today we have on author Rebecca Fogg. Rebecca has just published her first book called Beautiful Trauma, and Rebecca and I go way back. Rebecca and I used to work together at American Express, and the inciting incident or the initial thing that happened to Rebecca, which was an explosion in her apartment that caused physical trauma, is the starting point of the book that she wrote called Beautiful Trauma. But it is so much more than that. What Rebecca does is she talks about the incident, what happened to her, but also how do we recover from trauma? And what are some of the things that she did to recover from the trauma of a very physical injury that she had to overcome in order to really thrive and live her life the way that she wanted to? I am really inspired by Rebecca's story. She is just someone who has so much insight into how to take something negative that happens to us and really think about how do we take that, learn from it, and productively move forward. So I am looking forward to hearing this conversation with Rebecca. With that, we're going to jump right into it. Here we go. Oh my goodness. I am so excited to have with me today on the show, Rebecca Fogg.
Hello, I am so psyched to be here, and I can remember all the last times we were together.
Yes, you and I worked together at American Express and knew each other for years. So this story, which you write so beautifully in your memoir, Beautiful Trauma, it's a story that I'm so glad you have made into a book, which is getting phenomenal traction. I want to congratulate you for the Daily Mail piece that just came out, and also Publishers Weekly naming your book number 2, right, in the must summer reads for nonfiction. I mean, amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the incident that inspired the book. There are 2 traumas you talk about in the book, but let's talk about the first one first, which is the incident that happened in your apartment in 2006.
So I had stayed up late working for the same company, and it was about 2:30 in the morning, and finally decided to go to bed. Was standing at the sink about to brush my teeth, turned on the faucet, and nothing but air came out like a cappuccino maker. Psh. And, you know, if you're in New York, you live in a 1-bedroom apartment. If there's something the matter with your sink, you're fine because you've got another one. If there's something the matter with your toilet, you've got a problem. So just instinctively, practically without thinking, I reached over to flush the toilet. I heard a very loud noise, and then instantly I was totally disoriented. And I saw some blood on the wall, and I thought, whose is that? And then, you know, slowly the gears start moving. I was like, oh, I live alone. Must be mine. Huh, what happened? And somewhere apparently in the deep recesses of my mind, the brain was saying, look at your wrist. And I turned right to look at my wrist, and there was a giant hole in it. So what had happened was the air pressure in the plumbing had gotten too high. That's a long story, but it was nobody's fault. I want to point that out. And the toilet had exploded, hit my 10.5-foot ceiling, blew all the tiles off the wall. And right when my hand was on the handle, a shard of porcelain just cut straight through to the bone. So partially amputated my hand. And what that means, practically speaking, is every single thing that you need to close your hand was severed. So it was 8 tendons, a major nerve, and an artery. And at that point, it was interesting because I had a few they felt slow realizations, but they probably happened very fast, that I needed to save myself because nobody would be coming for me. and I needed to stop the bleeding and call 911 before I passed out.
Mm-hmm.
I did those two things and then woke up the neighbors. That was an unhappy surprise for them. And that's a whole nother story. And then the paramedics did a beautiful job and they got me to Bellevue Hospital, which is a level 1 trauma center and gets all of the acute trauma in the New York area. And so the next day, some amazing surgeons replanted my hand, which means they found all the bits that they could. They stitched them together. And then that started a difficult, painful, uncertain healing process because they couldn't know how well I would heal and how much functionality I would get back. So all in all, it ended up being 3 months out of work, about 300 hours of hand therapy and 45 hospital visits. So it was an absolutely life-changing experience. Fortunately, I have an extremely functional hand. It's a very different hand. It feels and behaves differently than this one, but I have been able to continue to live fully. And I am deeply grateful for that every day.
Okay. So, wow. And as somebody who lived in Manhattan for years, I completely understand that even just the sound that probably was going on when you go to turn the water on and nothing comes out. And no one tells you, oh, don't flush the toilet in that scenario.
Right.
Why would you know that?
Yeah.
So now that you've had years to reflect, what do you think what got you out to the neighbors? I know you said you had the thought, nobody's going to come. I've got to make a call. But then you got yourself to the neighbors because if I recall, you were trying to figure out how to make sure you could kind of alleviate whatever the damage is going on while waiting for paramedics. So how did you get out there and make that happen?
Well, I wondered the same thing. So as soon as the dust started to settle on the accident, I started to piece together the very fragmented recollections of, this tumultuous night. And I realized that I didn't feel fear until the paramedics arrived. And I didn't feel pain until I got to the hospital. And that absolutely astonished me. I mean, how was that possible? So that's part of what made me want to research the science. And one of the things I learned all about was what, a lot of people commonly call the fight flight response. And, what that is this, in my mind, extraordinarily optimistic thing. It is a property of humanity. It is inexhaustible. It happens as often as you need it. It's not a matter of privilege. It is something that is built in, and it is our threat detection system. And it detects threats to us socially, conceptually, physically, and it mobilizes the body and the brain's resources to prime you to escape. And what happens in that moment is then there are all of these chemicals rushing around, making sure that you have enough blood in your arms and legs to flee if you need to. There's a more detailed description of that in the book. But what it's also doing is, it is helping you do time-tested strategies for survival. And then at a certain point, though, your conscious mind has to take over because there are variables that evolution hasn't thought of. And so what was going on in that moment, like, how did I know I was going to wake up the neighbors? It was a lot of background processing going on that I will never have access to. But what I experienced it as was just this lightning quick decision making. And it was really interesting because I'm like, okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to be conscious long enough, to do the two things I need to do. So I'm going to call 911 first to make sure there's an ambulance on the way in case I, try to stop the bleeding and lose consciousness. So, will I use a terry cloth towel or a tea towel to do that, et cetera. So it was just problem solving mode. And that is something that, we all do every day, but there are things about our experience, our past, our training, our education that gives you some more access to that. But one of the decisions was, okay, I'm on the phone with 999, I've stopped the bleeding. She's reminded me to raise it over my head. And now we're like, okay, so the ambulance is coming, but I live in an apartment building. The front door is locked. And I don't know if it was her idea or my idea, but it was like, neighbors, that's something we can delegate. And then it was once I'd woken up the neighbors, once I told them I just need somebody to open that door, that is when I checked out. And that is when terror like I have never experienced flooded. And I explained that to myself as my brain was like, okay, your part of the job is done. You've passed the baton. Now you're going to feel the feels. And then similarly, I didn't feel pain until I got to the hospital. And I think there could be a variety of reasons for that. But there is also this thing called descending analgesia, where your brain releases opioids that stop certain sensory signals from getting to the brain to be processed as a conscious perception of pain.
Wow. So a friend of yours gave you this advice to become an expert on your injury. Can you talk about what that meant for you, and in terms of what did it mean to become an expert? And then what was the effect of becoming an expert?
Yeah, this was really a turning point in my recovery. And, I've tried to tell him how much this meant to me, and he will just never know. But it was about 10 days after the accident. And as I've described it before, you're just catapulted into this, alien universe where you don't know the laws of nature. You don't know the language. Everything is strange. You feel broken. It's just incredibly challenging. And I suddenly remembered there was this guy that I knew who had a crazy accident, and maybe it was similar. I don't know. And it turns out he'd had a very serious accident with some, nerve injury as well. And when he suggested that I learn all about my hand, my first thought was, well, the surgery is over. I don't have any further treatment, other than hand therapy. I don't have any decisions to make. So why would I do that? Which is a weird thing for me to say because I'm a really curious person. But at the same time, I guess when you're in, you're kind of still in survival mode. So you're like, why would I do anything extraneous? Like, what purpose is this going to serve? And he said, because when you know what your hand is trying to do in healing and how hard it is, then you are going to notice smaller progress sooner, which is going to hearten you. And you're also going to be less demoralized when things happen slowly or when you lose functionality, because you're going to lose something. And he was right about that. And I'm getting chills as I think about this right now. And so at that point, I was like, okay, I'm going to take your word for it, because I just can't get my head around anything right now, but I'm going to take your word for it. And then the other important thing was just being so incapacitated and so dependent. I was staying with my sister for like the first week, and then I was with my mom for like the next week. And then after that, I was on my own, and my friends stepped in and did a rotation and just always came by. And it was just amazing. Please do that for your friends, your neighbors, your strangers. I was so incapacitated in so many ways, and progress was so slow and invisible to me that studying the science gave me a sense of purpose. It gave me a sense of progress because I was learning, and undoubtedly I was learning. The first time the doctors use those words, I don't understand. The second time they use those words, I do understand. And then also it proved that there was a part of me that was still there. Everything about my life was so unrecognizable at that point. And everything that I was feeling was so unrecognizable that this process of learning and studying and thrilling in this interesting and optimistic science really, made me feel like, all right, I'm hanging in there and there's something to build on here. I'm still absolutely fascinated by it. I read almost nothing but medical science for another 10 years. And then it was another 5 years of studying it for the book. And it's now, it turned me on to healthcare, and it's been, a big part of my life.
Yeah. So it sounds like by doing the research, by really understanding what was going on with your body, it helped you in not just an intellectual way, but probably emotionally as well, because it gave you kind of a direction to point your energy. I would love, though, if you could talk too about the implications in terms of when you go through something traumatic that is freak. It's a freak accident, right? I mean, it's not just a trauma. You couldn't have predicted that this was going to happen. And frequently, I know as human beings, we can get very angry about those things. Can you talk about whether you had anger at this freak accident and the implications for your life? And then what did you do with that anger?
Yeah, I'm pausing a little bit because I always have to think hard because I think that the emotions are so intertwined. I don't recall feeling angry, and I think I would have if the accident had been preventable. But as far
Mm.
as, the system was inspected afterwards, the city came in and inspected it, and there was no human error, nothing was out of code. I think that was very, very important in just feeling that it was terrible luck, but that it wasn't, that it wasn't
Mm.
preventable. So I didn't feel anger in that respect. What was quite difficult was not knowing exactly how I was going to care for myself next.
Mm.
Wanting to kind of be able to completely put the load down for once and for all, but not really having that ability. And so I think that it did work out, and I now have a better understanding of what can happen and how to mobilize resources, and also just that so many more people want to help than you would ever imagine. People really did step in a wonderful way. But then there were also, one of the things I learned in studying the science is that if we are traumatized by something, very often the people who love us most are as well. And you just don't know how you're going to respond until it happens. And
Mhm.
so, the way I think about it now, there are some people who are really amazing in the first inning. They're really great in that crisis moment and organizing and everything and being there and everything. But they might not, it's almost like an entrepreneur. The person who starts the company might not be the one to
Mm.
take it to maturity.
Mm.
But then
Mhm.
there are the second inning players, and maybe they aren't the ones who are good with the blood and the
Mhm.
hospital and all of that, but they're really good at the just sitting and listening and
Mm.
witnessing and making sure
Mhm.
that you have, your favorite food and all of that. And so I think at times for me it was, hard and hurtful when there were people who I had hoped, might be there and couldn't be. But
Mhm.
it was, I think, because it was because I saw how bizarre it was, like because I was so thrown for a loop, I think I wasn't angry because I could just imagine suddenly I knew that it had just thrown everybody for a loop. And in the
Mhm.
end, I did have everything that I needed. And there's also a certain amount of uncertainty that you just can't do away. No one can take that away for you. I know many people, unfortunately, adversity is universal. So I know many people who have been maybe very, very ill and have a wonderful family support network, but it's a very difficult situation for the family, and people have jobs and people have children. And,
Mhm.
so there is a certain aspect of trauma or any just, acute adversity that is difficult. There's some suffering you just can't take away.
As you're talking, I'm thinking to myself that you have an enormous amount of empathy. You have empathy for yourself, I think, and not you giving yourself some grace to recognize that recognition that things were going to be different moving forward and wanting to give yourself the opportunity to learn more about it, learning about your injury, but then also recognizing that the people around you who loved you, cared for you, may be better at different stages
Mhm.
of the trauma you were dealing with.
Yep.
And that is such an insightful but empathetic view of people because I think we think to ourselves, well, this person loves me. They need to be there for me how I need them.
Mm-hmm.
How do you view empathy and thinking about it as it relates to how you were able to recover and the process of healing from this trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, let's be clear. I'm human. I want people to be there for me the way I want them to be there for me all the time forever. I mean, why wouldn't you?
We all do. We all do.
Good. And I'm sure they want that of me too. I think maybe where some of that empathy came from is I could also see in me in my situation. And then I was thinking immediately of like, oh my gosh, I had a friend who had like a knee replacement 3 years before. Why wasn't I at her house every single night cooking her dinner? Like, wow. So
Mhm.
in a way, it gave me a new lens. So it
Mhm.
definitely, the empathy, there was an empathy gain in there.
I'm actually just thinking that what
Yeah.
you just said about how you thought about this friend who had
Mm.
had something with her knee that you were thought to yourself, well, gosh, I should have been there. Now I
Yeah.
understand that. And
Yeah.
it's almost as if the trauma gave
Mhm.
you empathy in a way that maybe you did not have that before. I think that what I'm trying to get at is what is required,
Mm.
do you think, to heal from trauma?
So obviously it's going to be different for everybody. And one of the things I learned in studying the science that has been probably the most powerful learning, and people who are watching and who are in the healthcare space will know this already, but our health status, how we respond to life, how we respond to trauma, adversity, any of those things, it's not just down to our conscious mind and our grit or all of those things. Culturally, we like to make heroes of people who survive things. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be proud of people and enthusiastic about that. But there's so much more involved. It's biological factors, psychological, social, environmental factors. Classic examples are it's pretty hard for a kid to learn if they have an empty stomach. And so if you're praising the kids who are the stars in the class, there are many more factors that make us who we are and how we're able to respond. And that's where resilience comes in. So in terms of empathy, I think that learning, what's required to survive, going to be different for everyone. But certainly if you have the wherewithal, ask for help, a willingness to confront your own vulnerability. And, in my situation, that was something I was never really happy to do before the accident. I wasn't happy to do it during the accident. And you've known me for a long time, Eliza. I don't like to not have charge of the situation. I don't want to need help. I didn't want to ask for help. And suddenly being in a situation where that was absolutely essential, then I learned not only that was okay because there was no other way, but also, as my best friend tells me, and she appears in the book multiple times, she was like, people want to help. Why wouldn't you let them? What's the matter with you? And sort of put that way, I could see that as it's an ecosystem. We help each other. You help me when I need help. I help you. And that's not a transaction. That's love, whatever you want to call it, whether you know the person or not. So I think to get through it, ask for, a willingness to confront your vulnerability, an ability to ask for and accept help. And a lot of it is just waking up every day and just trying to do what you can. Yeah. And that's going to be different for everybody. I had the great fortune to have healthcare, and that's something that drives me nuts. I've studied it. I listened to different podcasts, and the fact that we live in a country where I feel lucky to have healthcare, in the US, you shouldn't have to be lucky to have healthcare. And now I live in a country where everybody has it. We all have different challenges in our cultures. But in any case, if you have the time to focus on yourself and to focus on your recovery and the ability to create that space, that's really important. It's doing everything you can and also recognizing that a lot of it isn't up to you. Nature has to take its course. That is a very difficult lesson. There's many ways to recover as there are injuries and traumas.
I appreciate your perspective on that. I want to talk a little bit about 9/11 because that's also something that you talk about, I guess, about a little, maybe less than 5 years before the incident with your arm. But can you talk about 9/11 as the other traumatic event and how that kind of came into play with your experience and journey?
Yeah. And you were there too, weren't you? Weren't you in the office? Yeah.
Yeah. I think we worked on the same floor in the same building at the same time.
So, yeah. Yeah. So they were similar and they were different. The differences were all of Manhattan went through 9/11. Everybody has their story. Everybody was affected. It wasn't a question of whether you had a 9/11 story. It was what was your 9/11 story. And that's very different than, the hand situation. So I felt in 9/11 that we'd all been catapulted to a strange new universe. And there was solace in the companionship. So the fact that I was going through it with all of these people, and as I remember it, probably not everybody did want to talk about it, but I remember a lot of talk about it. I think we didn't do anything but talk about it for probably a whole year. We were, back to work like the next day, basically doing the business continuity plan, calling to make sure all of our employees had gotten out, which was the hardest phone call I ever made. And thank goodness, the team had made it home. But there was that collective, it was a collective trauma. There were people who later lost their lives, in the search. So my heart goes out to people who had a direct loss, an impact of health, a loss of career, of livelihood. But for us that made it out physically intact, psychologically, we helped each other. That was my perspective. It was a healing process that I was already plugged into that. And of course I had work to distract me. Yeah. Let's just say it wasn't a distraction, but it was something to focus that extra energy on.
Absolutely.
And I would say, actually, that's where I first learned about what my trauma experience is. So there's a really interesting study done by George Bonanno at Columbia University, and they surveyed people right after 9/11, and then like 3 months later, 6 months later. And what they found was that, a decent number of people, I'm not going to quote the statistics because I don't remember exactly, but they're in the book, experienced symptoms of PTSD, as did I, certainly. I was exhausted. I was thinking about the event constantly. I have this reaction now that I know is, clearly my traumatic response. It's like just bursting into tears for seemingly no reason. And I feel like for about 3 weeks, I was doing what I called sleeping and weeping all the time. And then after that, I and most other people that they studied as well integrated it into their experience. Those symptoms went away. So only a very small number could actually be classified as having PTSD, which is where, a certain handful of symptoms persist for longer than a month. So now remember, it's squidgy. That doesn't mean that their lives didn't change, their perspectives didn't change, that there weren't some adverse things, but it just wasn't classically. Whereas with my accident, I was the only one who was experiencing that. And that added a level of difficulty. And of course, I was physically impaired for a while. But the fact that I did come out of it okay, that helped. But I do still, it's interesting. I'm still learning about this. And I actually recently just started doing EMDR, which is a kind of trauma-focused therapy, because after writing the book and spending all of this time studying it, I realized that I had unfinished business that was related to maybe not those two particular traumas in themselves. But I wanted to explore more, and it's been really helpful.
It's interesting that you can talk about it, and that you talk about it in that way, that one trauma was a very individualized trauma because it just was you, and the other was a communal trauma. It was something that a lot of your colleagues and friends were experiencing at the same time. And it just stands to reason that that's a very different experience, and healing from those are very different, because you have a whole lot of people who can understand what you're experiencing in one of them, but in the other, it just is just you.
Yeah.
And not that only you have had an experience like that.
Right.
But it's a much more individualized thing. If you could give people one piece of advice or insight, because you have done so much thinking about this, about, what to do and how to think about getting yourself onto a road to recovery when you have experienced a trauma, what advice would you give them?
So one of them is try to be gentle with yourself. My mother always used to say that, and it comes up over and over again in a lot of popular wellness and mental health things, but it's still true. Recognize that there are some things that are beyond your control, and try to be gentle to yourself. That is one for sure. Try to find a way to make progress, even if it's not progress in the recovery, so if it is slow healing, or it's uncertain, or it's just really frustrating and demoralizing at times, you're going to have ups and downs, expect it to be challenging at times. Coping is hard. Coping doesn't mean that, you could be doing the best you can and coping brilliantly. That doesn't mean it feels good. But, if you can look for another way to make and feel progress. So a lot of people like to write. There are actually some really interesting programs. Mayo Clinic has one. There are oral history programs, but where people going through an illness or a trauma will write about it. That helps some people, but it also doesn't have to be writing. It can be, make a voice note in your journal every day, make a voice note on your phone every day, and then it feels good to have committed something to yourself and do it every day. And then also you might get insights from that, or do a couple Duolingo classes every day,
Yeah.
or buy a flowering plant and watch it bud. And, this is not a replacement for professional help. If you can get professional help in terms of therapy or an employee resource group, seek that out. Absolutely. But I'm talking about, these are moments when every little thing that you can do helps. And so, I found beauty in nature, taking walks in Brooklyn Bridge Park, just sitting on a bench and staring and, letting people just smile as they walked by. New Yorkers get a bum rap, but they were really friendly people. And put yourself in situations where, you can be interacting with humans. It doesn't even have to be your best friends.
Yeah.
It's community, it's making progress, it's asking for help, professional help if you can find it. Also, I would say, do not be afraid to rigorously question your healthcare professionals. You should understand everything that is going to help you feel more confident about what's happening next, and everything that's going to help you participate to your fullest ability. The healthcare system is overloaded. Everybody wishes that everybody had more time to sit with patients. They wish they had more time to sit with patients. That shouldn't stop you from asking the question. And after I was fully recovered, I went back to the hospital where I was treated, and I was a volunteer visitor with patients, and I wasn't giving therapy. I was just there to listen if they wanted to talk. And sometimes the ones who wanted to talk were nervous about things that weren't actually going to happen, but they'd been afraid to ask the doctor or the nurse because the doctors and the nurses were so busy that here the patient was worried about something that they didn't need to be worried about. And so I do think that there are some people who don't know how to form the questions. And so it's, think about what you want to know. And don't be afraid to ask those questions. Everybody wants you to feel comfortable going into the next treatment or your occupational therapy and doing what you know how to do. And confident doesn't mean it feels great. It doesn't mean you feel like you've got it all under control. It's just, It can take away a layer of suffering. At least there's a little bit of the unknown that maybe you can take away if you understand that better and ask those questions.
Thank you. Those are wonderful pieces of advice. The writing about it, the feeling like you're making some progress, even if it's small but incremental. And it doesn't have to be related to the injury, as you said. It could just be that you're getting smarter or more knowledgeable about what happened to you, or taking on something else and seeing progress there. But this idea of progress is important. Becca, how do people find the book, Beautiful Trauma, if they want to go out and get themselves a copy and read it?
Wonderful. It is on sale everywhere books are sold right now. And if you order it, then you will get your copy. And I read the audio version. So if you want to hear me with a slight cold, I shouldn't say that, but you can listen to it. You can read it on ebook or order a hard copy. And if you do, I really hope that it resonates. It meant a lot to me to be able to write it and be able to thank the people who helped me recover, and many scientists and medical professionals who helped me do my research.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you for the gift of your story and the book and being on the show with us today.
It's all I could ever want to come from this. So thank you so much, Eliza, for having me.
I'm so grateful and so happy to see how you have been able to turn this into something that can help other people. It's a great gift. Thank you for listening. If you're an influencer or a brand that wants to work with us, please feel free to email us at info@shespeaks.com. Until next time.